We turn now to something kind of new in the course. Up until now, we've looked at Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, who, as I've said, are sort of uniformly taken to be the defining figures, for sociology and anthropology as well. Turning now to Ferdinand de Saussure, we're looking at someone different in that the first three were explicitly concerned with social relations, understanding social relations, studying social relations, and generating theory to make sense of how social relations work, what their nature is, what we need to pay attention to, and so forth. Saussure had a different background and was organizing his studies around different things. He was a linguist. You can see that he was a linguist who was alive, sort of overlapping with all of the other three figures, almost an exact contemporary of Emile Durkheim, and though Swiss, also publishing in French, and so his interest, his body of work, slim as it was, but as significant as it was, concerned language. He wasn't explicitly studying social relations, though he thought that his breakthroughs in the development of structural linguistics could be applied to the study of societies as well beyond language. We'll see that when we get to Lévi-Strauss in the coming week. But Saussure, as I say, was not concerning himself with the study of social relations. He doesn't figure as a defining individual with respect to sociology or anthropology for our purposes, but his influence is undeniable on the development of one of the most important schools of anthropology in the 70s and 80s, and that is structuralism. Now, also, I include Nietzsche here, not because Nietzsche is part of this course, but because he has the same penchant for astonishing facial hair that the others do. I may come back to talk about that later, but for now, he's just in there because that mustache. Now, Saussure. Okay. Saussure was a linguist at a time when linguistics was really organized around ideas of tracing how the meanings of words changed over time, trying to chase down the roots of words to see how they formed. So if you think of the Latin roots for many English words, for example, then linguistics at that time would have been concerned with tracing out how a particular word has its roots in Latin and how the meaning has changed from that initial root, how it's adapted from that initial root, how it's held traces from that root, and so forth. Saussure had a different interest. So he, he wasn't interested so much in the study of how any particular words in any particular language could trace their roots here or there. He was interested in the nature of language as such, not any particular language, but language on the whole. He says then, language is not a function of the speaker. It is a product that is passively assimilated by the individual. Speaking, on the contrary, is an individual act. So then we don't create the language as individuals that we speak, but rather we speak the language that we inherit, that we're given. So we take what's available to us and we produce speech, or indeed writing, with the language that is already established before us. In this way, you could think of it in terms of language not being something that belongs to us, but in a way we belong to the language. That the language is there before us, we inherit it, we employ it within a community of people who share that language, but we don't actually get anything like ownership over it. We're not really, as individuals, in control of it. We can only control our own speech and our own writing. Now, the way that Saussure distinguishes these is with the word langue and parole. So the French terms roughly for language and speech. You could think of this as what people say and the material with which they say what they say. So then, at any time, language is the existing totality and structure of signs. Signs is an important idea that is going to be crucial throughout the rest of Saussure's work, which I should now indicate to you. So this is the work that we've read excerpts from this. He actually didn't write the book himself. This is taken from his students and their notes and his lecture notes. They produced it after I believe it may have been posthumous, but I'm not actually totally sure of that. Anyway, the point being that this is not something that he published for himself. This is something published out of his notes and his students' notes on his lectures. In any case, so then he's not thinking of language as something that is spread out over time. He's trying to think of language in a given moment. And that's why his emphasis is on this idea of an existing totality within a specific moment in time and the structure that a language has in a given moment, which is the structure under which all of its users will operate. We all have to accept the structure of the language as it is. Otherwise we become incomprehensible when we try to use it. And that the structure is constituted of signs. And I'll get to talk about signs more in a moment. But the thing that I want to get at here is that signs exist within a linguistic structure. And so signs are a crucial element of Saussure's linguistics. Now, speech or parole, that does unfold in time, of course, right? That whatever word I start a sentence with comes earlier in time than the words that follow afterwards. And that is open to the will of the individual speaker, but also, as I said, it's entirely constrained by the existing structure of the language, langue. If I want to communicate using language with other people, then I have to work within the structure of the given language, because as soon as I depart from that structure, the way that I put the words together will be meaningless if they're identifiable as words at all, and so, or signs at all. And so this is the constraint that is also the very possibility of using language to be meaningful to other people. So you could rephrase that to say that the constraint of language is also the possibility of creating meaningful speech or meaningful writing. Now, speech further is always social. Partly this is because when we speak with a listener in mind. It may be a particular individual or group of individuals, or it may be sort of an abstract audience. So, as an example, I don't know all of the people who are going to be watching this, but I'm presuming that there will be people watching this as I speak. So I have that notion of a listener in mind. In part, this is also because speech employs Lang, which is necessarily public, is necessarily shared. Right? If we didn't share it, we wouldn't be able to use it to communicate with one another. So that we can only use speech on the basis of shared language. Okay, how does this work then? In Saussure's sketch, and these are sketches from pages 11 and 12, a circuit of speech opens in person A's brain. In the brain, person A associates concepts with sound images. And so far, this is completely psychological phenomenon. Nothing physical has actually happened yet. Just this association has occurred. But this psychological phenomenon becomes a physiological process as A produces the sounds that correspond with the image. And these travel to the ear of person B. Then the same circuit, but in reverse, occurs in B's brain, where there's the reception of the sound images that are tied to certain concepts within B's brain, and that is the nature of the comprehension by B of what A has uttered. So you get this this process of going from the mental to the physiological and physical in sound waves, or again, it could be in writing, back into the mental with the recipient. And already here we can see we have the constituents of the sign, the concept and the sound image. So the sign is made up of these two elements. So you can have a concept of a tree, and you can have a sound image that corresponds with that concept. These two elements then, these are going to be the things that constitute the linguistic sign. And Saussure called the concept and sound image signified and signifier. So a sign is made up of a combination of a signified and a signifier. You have in the diagram here, you can see the concept and the sound image are knit together to make the sign. Also, using his terminology, you get the signified and the signifier bound together to create the sign here. Now then, Saussure points out that the bond between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. That's a curious thing. So what does it mean to say that the sign is constituted by an arbitrary bond between signifier and signified, between the concept of tree and the sound image of the word tree as we speak it? What is it to say that that's an arbitrary relationship? What it means is that there's nothing intrinsic or natural connecting the specific concept with the specific sound image. So it's not as if there's anything in this material that evokes the term teacup. That is an arbitrary relationship. And we can see this arbitrariness most clearly when we consider how different languages will use different signifiers for shared or similar signifieds. So tree, the concept, is tree, the sound image, in English. It's arbre in French. It's árbol in Spanish. It's tonmai in Thai. All of these, according to Saussure, are different signifiers attached to the same concept. The connection then is entirely a matter of convention. You could say it's a conventional connection, because language is always inherited, right? So that we inherit from those who are in our speech community the specific constitution of the sign with this arbitrary signifier attached to, in an arbitrary way, to the signified. So that the signs that we inherit, again, are not built on anything intrinsic to the concepts that they express. We get them through convention from those who share the language. Again, this is part of the reason, this arbitrariness is part of the reason that when we come to speak, we do so only on the basis of this shared common language built on the conventions of those who have come before us, not on anything intrinsic given in the objects, or given in the concepts, I should say. We haven't gotten to objects yet. We're still just dealing with concepts and sound images. The signifier, further, is something that unfolds in time, right? Because any word is constituted by a whole bunch of sounds, right? Phonemes, we call them. And they unfold in time, so that as I start a word, I start with one particular phoneme that will be shared by other words, but it's the way that the rest of the word, or the signifier, unfolds, that occurs within time. The beginning of the word starts before the end of the word, to put it most simply. So then we do get some kind of time span associated with a signifier. And it unfolds in a linear direction, right? It goes forward in time from the beginning toward the end. It doesn't go in any other direction. It can't go backward, and so forth. So then you have this quality, this temporal quality of the signifier. The signified is different. Because it's conceptual, it's neither temporal nor linear. It doesn't unfold in time. It's just a concept that is, you could think is sort of, it's just there. And it will connect with this signifier that does unfold in time, because it's constituted by phonemes. But it itself doesn't share that temporal nature, that temporal quality. Time enters Saussure's thought on semiotics, which is the structural linguistic that he developed, in another way, though. So semiotics, the study of signs. When he approaches the analysis of language, he acknowledges that language, again, because it's social and because of the arbitrary relationship of signifier and signified, changes. Languages are not static. They don't hold still eternally. They change over time. New words get introduced. The way that words are used will change within speaking communities. You can see that even things like the way that words are spoken will alter over time, which is why English speakers don't all have the same accents. So changes in language, he thinks then, are not the result of any one person's initiative. It's not up to any individual. It is a question of conventions and how conventions change within a given community over time. So it's a matter of social forces that shift the relationship of signifier and signified. And so we can see this very clearly in how we use the word gay and how that has changed over several generations. So by way of example, when I was young, a millennium ago, the word gay was a term that you could not use with reference to another person without it having a pejorative quality to it. It was necessarily an insulting term. It was intended or used as a degradation of sorts. Now, over the intervening generations, the pejorative quality of the term gay has eroded really significantly. Now you can use the term as a simple descriptor for a person without intending any kind of insult, because it's no longer universally or even predominantly regarded as an insult. And it can now simply be a descriptive term, right? And if we go back further still, of course, we can recognize that there was a point at which gay simply meant something like happy. It didn't have any connotations around sexuality at all. Now, this way that language changes is what Saussure identifies as the diachronic aspect of language. So diachronic, dia, over changing, over chronic, time, diachronic. What interests Saussure, however, and this is the thing that was groundbreaking in his work, is not the way that he treats diachronic aspects of language. That work was already being done, but rather his focus on the synchronic aspect of language. So language at any given moment of time, not language over time, which is hopefully captured in this image here. You can see that as time passes, you get this diachronic change that you can track, but you can also look at any given moment, these sort of slices of time, to get the synchronic aspect of language. This is why he emphasizes this notion of language taken as a total system of signs. And in order to do that, you have to take it as a total system of signs at a given moment. It sort of loses its coherence, the idea of a total system, if you think about it temporally, because we can't be sure that, say, Old English is part of the same system as our contemporary English. Does the one have a historical connection to the other? Sure. But that's a diachronic question, not a synchronic question. And so what Saussure wants to focus on is this idea of a totality that you can only meaningfully study taking it at a specific moment in time. So then speech, he says, draws on this synchronic reservoir of signs. And we can appreciate this point when we think that there are words that fall out of the language over time, that with that diachronic change. Some terms will fall out of language, new words will, or new signs, I should say, will enter the language. So if we were hypothetically to go back in time, 3 generations and try and talk to people about computers, there would be a lot of misunderstanding, because for most people, probably for everybody, the word computer would not have the same signified that it has for us now. Go back 200 years, the term may not have any significance whatsoever. So then, speech draws on the synchronic reservoir of signs, the totality of signs at a given moment. That's what we have access to. That's what we can employ when we use language. Put it another way, we don't have access to signs that are outside our current reservoir of signs with which to communicate meaningfully with other people. Another way to think of this is if I start trying to draw on signs that exist in a different language with somebody who doesn't share that language, I'm not communicating with them in through a shared language. He says, the linguistic fact can be pictured in its totality, i.e. language, as a series of contiguous subdivisions marked off on both the indefinite plane of jumbled ideas, represented by A up here, and the equally vague plane of sounds, identified with B down here. Right? So you get these slices where a concept up here from A has its associated sound image or signifier down here in B, and that it's this arbitrary relationship that constitutes the sign, and it's the totality of all of these arbitrary relationships constituting signs that makes up the language. Okay, so the sign is arbitrary. Saussure's other big innovation is to say that the sign is also differential. So what does that mean? It means that the signifier connects to a concept, signified, not to a thing. So the sign gets its value in relation to other signs, not by relating directly to a thing. So if we come back to the teacup here, you can think of it as having three elements. The signifier, which is the sound, teacup. The signified, which is not the material, but is the concept of a teacup that is wedded to the signifier to create the sign. And then you have just sort of the brute material fact of this thing. That would be what he calls the referent. So that language is constituted not by the association of referents with one another, but with the association of signs. It's the relation between signs that constitute the language. Now, the sign is differential then in two different ways that he calls, again, this is technical vocabulary, syntagmatic and associative relations. Two different kinds of relations that make the sign differential. Just in passing, I'll note that some people call associative relations paradigmatic relations. He uses associative in the book, so I'm just going to stick with that for the rest of this. Syntagmatic relations, again, unfold in time, linearly, so that once again, you think of a sentence as starting somewhere, going through several signs, and then coming to an end somewhere else. And that this is temporal in nature, so that the way that the words or that the signs get their value depends on their relationship to the other signs as the sentence unfolds. So when we say the cat scratched the dog in this sentence, highlighted here in green, the fact that the signs appear in the order in which they did, cat, scratched, dog, for example, gives each one its value, so that we know by this, by its temporal unfolding, that it's the cat doing the scratching and not the dog scratching the cat. In this way, it's the relationship in time between the signs that gives them their particular value, and that this value will change when they appear in different sentences alongside different signs. So this is anyway the syntagmatic axis, how they unfold in time. He says, in the syntagm, a term acquires its value only because it stands in opposition to everything that precedes or follows it, or both. So it's this temporal set of relationships between the signs that gives them their value. Associative or paradigmatic relations are not linear, so they are comparable to the signified, to concepts in a way. Analogically, they're like that. They're not linear. They're formed outside of discourse. Discourse is the actual production of language in one's memory, so that one has a vocabulary on which one can draw, the group of signs on which one can draw. That's your vocabulary, stored in your memory. He says the associative relationship unites terms in absentia, in a potential mnemonic series, mnemonic having to do with memory, so that the associative relations here are, again, organized into these groups that I've highlighted. So you could associate cat with asteroid, typewriter, elephant. They're other candidates that could fill that space within the sentence. And then, of course, because they would be different signs fulfilling that same role in the sentence, it would change the set of relationships on the syntagmatic axis. But we can think of it also this way, that when we think of a particular word, say brother, we'll also have a bunch of associated words that are either that spring to mind immediately or that are sort of on the periphery that we can draw on. So we might think brother, the first one that we'd think of is sister. And then we might think mother, father, aunt, uncle, all of these different terms that are all still just terms about kin that are associated with it because we associate them in our minds. Their concept, no, I shouldn't say that they're conceptual because, of course, they're signs, so they're constituted of both parts. But we could also think that brother might be associated not just with sister, but with church, monkhood, religion. So there would be a different set of associations. But all of these, he's saying, are associations that have this existence in our memory, built out of the vocabulary that we have. So that the associative relations are these ones that spring from any given sign outward toward the other signs that are not dependent on this syntagmatic axis, but rather are these associations that we make with that particular sign. So then the way that they hang together syntagmatically will change very dramatically if we say, instead of the cat scratched the dog, the elephant remembered the city, right? That these are going to be associative replacements that have a completely reorganizing impact on the syntagmatic axis. Why? Because the way that the signs syntagmatically relate to one another has utterly changed now from the original sentence. So these then are the two ways that signs are differential. And Saussure relies on a metaphor of a column to try and capture this difference between the two. So all of these columns have an architrave, right? But they are of different orders, a Doric order, an Ionic order, and a Corinthian order. He writes, on the one hand, the column has a certain relation to the architrave that it supports. The arrangement of the two suggests the syntagmatic relation, right? Like a fixed order. In language, it's in time. This is my misgiving about this particular metaphor, is that here we're not looking at an ordering in time. We're looking at an ordering in space. So it doesn't entirely hold, but this is the metaphor he's working with anyway. So we go back to it. So the arrangement of the architrave to the other elements, that is in comparison with the syntagmatic relation. On the other hand, if the column is Doric, it suggests a mental comparison of this style with others, Ionic, Corinthian. Although none of these elements is present in space, the relation is associative. So then, if we were to look just at the Doric, then we would see this relation in space of the architrave with the column and the lintel and so forth, and think, great, Doric column. But this set of associations, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, these would happen purely in our mind, that these would be associations out of our memory because we are so very familiar with the different styles of columns. And that's where we would get this associative relation. Okay, now let's go back to the arbitrary and differential aspects of the sign. So the sign is not naturally linked to the world, to the reference about which it speaks. That's the arbitrariness. And it is not naturally linked to any other signs. It's differential in that respect, right? That you can place signs together in ways that are specified only by the conventions of the language. There's nothing given in, say, the laws of nature that determine which you can put alongside which. As an example, red and green lights signal stop and go, but they can also mean port and starboard. With the unfortunate inclusion of this red light right in the middle of the plane here, it totally messes up my example, but you still have port and starboard on the plane, so that's what I'm going with. Or on a ship, if you hang these lanterns on port and starboard. So there's nothing natural or intrinsic that connects them to these concepts. It's purely conventional. Now, there's a tale. I don't know if it's true or not. It might be completely apocryphal, made up. But apparently, when cars were being introduced in China, and therefore roads with traffic laws for cars involving stoplights they were being adopted from places that already had stoplights in them. Apparently, Mao Zedong's wife, whose name I regret escapes me right now, felt that red was a color associated with progressiveness, and therefore red should actually mean go. And so she wished to reorganize the way that streetlights worked. Now, we can see two interesting things about this. Whether the story is true or not doesn't matter for this. One is that there importation of streetlights, and streetlights here are signs, right? They signify specific things. That introduction is into a given set of conventions already. And among those conventions at that point in time in China was the association of red with progressiveness. And so it seemed, from at least her point of view, like it was just an obvious thing that red should mean go. So that's the first thing. Again, Saussure, you can see, would say we can see how these associative relationships work with these signs. The other thing, though, is that we can also see that in order for stoplights to function in the way that they do in other places, there's a way that they had to adhere to the already existing signification that stoplights had in places that had already adopted them. Because otherwise, drivers from those places would get to China and it would just be chaos on the roads. Or Chinese drivers would go to other places in which green meant go and red meant stop, and again, chaos, right? So then there's a way that these sets of conventions were in tension with one another, one side, one out. How that works, how that kind of tension gets resolved, it's not something that Saussure has a way of dealing with in his course in general linguistics. That's not really the focus that he has. That's not the interest that he has. Perhaps that would be something that linguists with an interest in diachrony rather than synchrony would dwell on further. But all this to say then that there's an interesting way in which Saussure's insights into the associative relationships is it provides us with a way of thinking about how they wanted to adopt stoplights in China at that time and what they wound up going with, despite this initial inclination to make red mean go. So then we don't know a unit of language positively, a unit like a sign. We know it negatively only because it is not everything else. We know it only in respect of how it relates to other signs. So there's this kind of negative relationship. There's not, again, because of the arbitrariness of the sign, there's no positive fixed relationship between the concept and the sound image that we get. We know them only through the relationships that they have, the signs, with other signs within a given system. So when words, he says, or signs, are said to correspond to concepts, it is understood that the concepts are purely differential and defined not by their positive content, neither by the sound image nor by the concept then, but negatively by their relations with the other terms in the system. Their most precise characteristic is in being what others are not. So if you could think of this, I'm not sure if this metaphor is going to work the whole way through. I'll give it a try. So if you think of something like a gigantic grid, and on each point on the grid, you have a sign. And so the grid is exhaustive for that moment. It's synchronous in that way. Then at any given point within that grid, the sign that's located at that point does not get its significance in any positive way. It's not fixed in any way. It only gets its gets its value or its significance by the relationship that it has with all the other points on that grid and the way that those points are arranged at any given moment in a sentence as it's uttered by a speaker. This is the negative relationship of signs then. So then he says, language is a system of interdependent terms in which the value of each term results solely from the simultaneous presence of others. It's only in their relationship to one another that they gain their significance. So that the sign, any given sign in and of itself, doesn't have value. It only gains its value by the relations that it gets, syntagmatic or associative, for example, with all of the others. When I utter a sound, then, it only gains value by its context, how it differs from everything that surrounds it. And so, to this end, he says, a segment of language, let's say a sentence could be a segment of language. A segment of language can never, in the final analysis, be based on anything except its non-coincidence with the rest. Arbitrary and differential are two correlative qualities. Signs function then not through their intrinsic value, but through their relative position. Again, this idea that it's only how signs relate to one another, getting their value by being what everything else around them is not, getting their value only by how they're connected, related in time with the words that come before and after, or with the sentences that become before and after. We're dealing with signs though, so let's just say with the signs that become before and after in a sentence. That is the only way that they gain their value. So again, if we were to think of a word like put. Now, put can be a number of different signs. You can, with a shot put, right? You put a shot. You can put a coin in a meter. You can stay put. So that the signifier, the sound, will gain its value with the concept, the signified with which it's associated, depending on the different words that are around it, or the different signs, I should say, that are around it within a sentence. That's how we're going to know which value of put is at stake here. So if we go back to stoplights, each one, red, yellow, and green, gain their value arbitrarily. It could be otherwise. There's nothing intrinsic that makes red stop, yellow maybe be cautious, and green mean go. It's only in their relationship to one another within a given set of conventions that they gain the value that they have. Again, it could be otherwise. So then what we'll see in the next class is how Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist, took Saussure's ideas about structuralist linguistics and developed them into an approach for anthropology that became really one of the defining approaches for a generation of anthropologists. It has lost some of its salience now. There aren't so many people doing anthropology now who rely on structuralism as their method. There are some, but they're few in number now. But at a certain point, Saussure's way of Lévi-Strauss's way of adapting Saussure's semiotics to anthropology was absolutely groundbreaking and shifted the way that, as I say, a generation of anthropologists did their work. Okay, so that is for next time.